The dust was a living thing, a fine red powder that coated the tongue, settled in the creases of a man's soul, and promised nothing but thirst. Elias Thorne felt it in the grit between his teeth and saw it in the shimmering heat that warped the horizon into a drunken line. The sun was a hammer beating down on the cracked earth of his ranch, on the graying wood of his cabin, on the silent stones that marked the place where his life had ended and his existence had begun. His world was one of splintered fence posts, the low bawl of his meager herd, and a silence so profound it had its own weight. It was a silence he had cultivated, a fortress built of solitude where memory could not breach the walls too often. He was a man carved from the unforgiven landscape itself, weathered, hard, and preferring the company of wind to words. His hands, calloused and scarred, knew the language of rope and iron and soil better than they knew the touch of another person. He stood on a porch, a structure that sagged with the same weariness he felt in his bones, and watched the stagecoach approach. It was a black speck crawling through the haze, a disruption to the immense, indifferent quiet. A knot of something cold and unfamiliar, something akin to dread, tightened in his gut. This was his mother's doing. A letter had arrived weeks ago, carried by a neighbor, its pages filled with her familiar, looping script, a blend of concern and command. You cannot live like a ghost, Elias. You need a wife, a helpmate. I have made an arrangement. He had crumpled the letter, the paper crackling in protest, and thrown it into the cold hearth. He had sent no reply. He had assumed, foolishly, that his silence would be answer enough. But his mother was a force of nature as relentless as a prairie fire, and now the consequence of her meddling was kicking up a trail of that damnable red dust, drawing ever closer. The coach wheezed to a halt, the horses blowing, their flanks slick with sweat. The driver, a man whose face was a road map of every hardship the trail could offer, grunted a greeting. Elias gave a curt nod in return, his eyes fixed on the coach door. He had expected a woman, yes. In his mind, she had taken a vague shape, sturdy, broad-shouldered, with hands accustomed to work and a face plain enough not to stir any ghosts. A woman who understood hardship, who would demand little and contribute much. A practical solution, a practical problem, as his mother would have seen it. The door swung open, and the person who descended was not the woman of his imagination. She was small, almost bird-like, swallowed by a dark silk dress that had no place in this world of dust and sun. Her face was pale, her features delicate, and her black hair was coiled in a knot so severe it seemed to pull at the corners of her eyes. She moved with a liquid grace that was utterly alien to the jerky, sun-beaten movements of the people here. She was Chinese, and she was clutching a small, worn leather case as if it were the only anchor in a hostile sea. A profound, unsettling gap opened between the woman his mother had promised and the woman who now stood before him. This was not a helpmate. This was a porcelain doll, one that would shatter in the first gust of wind. The driver heaved a single trunk to the ground with a thud that seemed to shake the very foundation of Elias's world. He looked from the woman to her luggage, then back to her. She met his gaze, and her eyes were not fearful or demure. They were dark, intelligent, and held a stillness that was as unnerving as the silence of his own land. It was the gaze of someone who had seen worse things than a dusty ranch and a grim-faced man. He felt a surge of raw frustration, a bitter anger directed at his mother, at his own foolishness for not stopping this, and, unfairly, at the woman herself for simply existing. He wanted to order the driver to put her back on the coach, to turn around and erase this entire monumental mistake. He wanted to send her back, but the coach was already rattling away, a retreating cloud of dust its only farewell. He was left standing on his sagging porch with a woman who did not belong, a trunk that held mysteries he had no desire to solve, and the suffocating weight of an arrangement he had never agreed to. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was no longer his fortress. It was a shared space, filled with the unspoken questions and the profound, jarring presence of this stranger. The road back to town was little more than a pair of ruts carved into the earth, and the storm turned it into a churning river of red mud. For 2 days, rain lashed against the cabin, a relentless drumming that echoed the turmoil inside Elias. He had been trapped before, by blizzards, by injury, by the grief that had walled him in for years. But this was a different kind of confinement. He was caged with his own failure to prevent this, and with her. Her name, she had told him in a voice that was quiet but clear, was May. She spoke with a precision that made her few words feel heavy, deliberate. He had given her the small loft space, a cramped triangle of wood and shadow under the eaves, and in the long hours of the storm he was acutely aware of her every small movement above him. The soft creak of the floorboards, the rustle of fabric. It was an invasion. He expected tears, complaints, perhaps a delicate swoon. He expected her to be a burden, another mouth to feed from his dwindling stores, another problem in a life already saturated with them. Instead, there was only her quiet, observant presence. She moved through the cramped cabin with an economy of motion that was mesmerizing, never disturbing the careful, chaotic order of his solitude. She did not speak unless spoken to, and when he offered her a plate of dry biscuits and jerky, she accepted it with a small, formal bow of her head that made him feel like a brute. He watched her, his skepticism a hard shell around him. He watched her examine the worn spines of his few books, her fingers tracing the titles without pulling them from the shelf. He watched her study the way the rain found its way through a crack in the window frame, a slow, steady drip that collected in a tin pot he had placed there years ago. The first test came on the second night of the storm, a fierce gust of wind, a sound like a mountain cat's scream, tore a sheet of tin from the roof over the main room. Rainwater began to pour in. Not a drip, but a deluge, soaking the floorboards and threatening the sacks of flour and beans that were his winter provision. He cursed, grabbing a bucket and scrambling for a ladder, his mind racing. The leak was in a bad spot, impossible to reach from the outside in this gale. He would have to move everything, and he would lose half his supplies before he was done. It was a disaster, a back-breaking, spirit-crushing setback that was all too common in this life. As he wrestled with the heavy ladder, he heard a sound behind him. May was standing there, her silk dress exchanged for a simple set of dark trousers and a tunic she must have had in her trunk. Practical clothes that seemed as out of place on her as the dress had, yet somehow more suited to the woman inside them. In her hands she held his heavy oilcloth tarp, the one he used for covering the wagon. He had forgotten it entirely. Before he could speak, she pointed toward the high rafters. "The rope," she said. It was not a question, it was a statement of strategy. He paused, the ladder suddenly heavy in his hands. He looked where she was pointing, at the crossbeams and the coils of rope he kept slung over them. He looked at the tarp, then back at the leak. In a flash of insight that shamed him, he saw her plan. It was simple, efficient, and something his own frantic mind had completely overlooked. While he had been preparing for a long, arduous, and likely futile battle against the storm from the outside, She had devised a way to manage it from within. Together, in a silence punctuated only by the howl of the wind and the drumming of the rain, they worked. He climbed the ladder, his heavy boots finding purchase on the rungs, while she fed him the corners of the massive tarp. He secured it to the rafters, angling it just so, creating a makeshift channel that funneled the invading water directly into the largest washtub he owned. It was ingenious. The deluge was contained, his supplies were safe, and the roar of the water was now a controlled, rhythmic splash into the tub. He descended the ladder, his clothes damp, his hands aching. He looked at the solution, then at her. She stood by the hearth, her small frame radiating a calm that seemed impossible amidst the storm's fury. She had not panicked. She had not wept. She had observed the problem, identified a solution, and directed him to it with two simple words. In that moment, something in his perception of her fractured. The porcelain doll was gone, replaced by something far more complex and resilient. He saw not a liability, but a mind as sharp and practical as his own, perhaps even more so. He gave her a single, grudging nod. "It will hold," he said. "Yes," she replied, her gaze steady. "It will." A fragile truce settled over the cabin in the days that followed. The storm passed, leaving behind a world washed clean, the air sharp with the scent of wet sage and pine. The road remained impassable, a thick mire of mud that imprisoned them together. The silence between them changed again. It was no longer the tense silence of strangers forced into proximity, but the quieter, more contemplative silence of two people observing one another, taking each other's measure. Elias found himself watching her, not with suspicion, but with a growing, reluctant curiosity. She possessed a stillness he had never encountered. Where he was a creature of restless physical energy, she was one of profound, focused calm. She began to subtly transform the small cabin. It was not a grand reordering, but a series of small, almost imperceptible changes. She scrubbed the soot from the stones of the hearth until they shone. She mended a tear in his shirt with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. And she cooked. Using his meager supplies of flour, salt pork, and dried beans, she created meals that were nothing short of miraculous. She found wild onions growing by the creek and bitter greens he had always ignored, and with them she coaxed flavors from the bland staples that he had not thought possible. The cabin, which had always smelled of dust, leather, and wood smoke, now carried the warm, savory scents of her cooking. It was another invasion, but one that chipped away at the walls of his solitude, letting in a warmth he had long forgotten. He never commented on it, but he ate every last bite, and a part of him that had been dormant for years began to stir with a strange, unfamiliar sense of comfort. He was beginning to see that her resilience was not a fluke. It was the very core of her. The arrival of Silas Thorne shattered the quiet peace they had inadvertently built. Thorne rode in with two of his hired men, his horse a magnificent black stallion that was an arrogant statement of wealth and power. Thorne himself was a large man, florid and loud, who consumed all the air around him. He was Elias's cousin, a fact Elias did his best to forget, and he owned nearly the entire valley, save for Elias's small, stubborn plot. Thorne's land was vast, but it was dry. Elias's ranch sat on the aquifer, the only reliable source of water for miles, and Thorne had been trying to get his hands on it for years, first with offers of money, then with veiled threats. Thorne dismounted, his boots sinking into the still damp earth, and his eyes immediately fell on May, who was tending to a small herb garden she had started near the porch. A cruel, dismissive smirk spread across his face. Well, well, cousin," he boomed, his voice dripping with condescension. "I see you've finally found yourself some company. Though I confess, I thought you'd have better taste. Where did you order this one from?" His men snickered. Elias felt a cold, hard rage coil in his stomach. He moved to stand between Thorn and May, a silent, physical barrier. His hand instinctively drifted toward the Colt holstered at his hip. "State your business, Silas," he said, his voice low and flat. Thorn's smirk widened, enjoying the reaction. He ignored May as if she were a piece of furniture. "My business is the same as it's always been, this pathetic scrap of land. My final offer is on the table, $500. Take it, or I'll take the land for nothing." He gestured around at the small cabin, the mended fences. "Look at this place, Elias. You're starving out here. You're letting it all go to ruin. Let me put it out of its misery." "The answer is no," Elias said. "It was no last year, and it's no today. Now get off my property." The false bonhomie vanished from Thorn's face, replaced by a mask of pure malice. "That's a mistake," he hissed, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "This water belongs under my brand. I will have it, one way or another." He stared hard at Elias, then his eyes flicked to May again, a flicker of contempt and calculation in their depths. "You have 1 week. Then the offer is withdrawn, and I start taking things away." He mounted his horse, wheeled the animal around with a theatrical flourish, and rode off, his men trailing behind him like vultures. The threat hung in the air, thick and poisonous. It was no longer a private dispute. It was a public declaration of war. Elias stood there for a long moment, watching them disappear, the cold knot of rage in his gut tightening into a solid stone of dread. He was alone, outnumbered, and Thorn had the money and the influence to make good on his promise. He turned and looked at May. She was still kneeling by her small garden, her expression unreadable. She had not flinched, had not cried out. She had simply watched, her dark eyes missing nothing. He had brought her into this danger, or his mother had. Either way, she was here, and Thorn had seen her. She was now a part of it. The fragile truce was over. They were now allies in a war he was not sure he could win. The week passed with the slowness of a coming execution. Every shadow seemed longer. Every gust of wind sounded like the hoofbeats of approaching riders. Elias worked relentlessly, his movements tight with coiled tension. He checked the loads in his Winchester, cleaned and oiled his Colt until the mechanism was a whisper of smooth steel, and reinforced the door and window shutters of the cabin. He was preparing for a siege. Through it all, May was a silent, steady presence. She said nothing of Thorn's threat, but he saw a new alertness in her, a sharp awareness in the way she watched the horizon. She seemed to be fortifying the cabin in her own way, making sure the water barrels were full, preparing food that would not spoil, organizing his sparse supplies with a meticulous efficiency that spoke of a mind preparing for crisis. The catalyst came not as a frontal assault, but as a cruel act of destruction in the dead of night. A sound woke Elias from a light, fretful sleep, the frantic, terrified bellowing of his cattle. He grabbed his rifle and was out the door in an instant, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The moon was a sliver in the bruised purple sky, casting long, distorted shadows. In the faint light, he could see them. 2 of Thorn's men on horseback, riding hard through his small herd, their whoops and hollers sharp and ugly in the night air. They were driving the cattle toward the deep ravine at the northern edge of his property. It was not just a stampede, it was a slaughter. Rage, cold and pure, burned through him. He raised the Winchester to his shoulder, but they were too far, moving too fast among the terrified animals. He could not get a clean shot without risking hitting one of his own herd. He started to run, his boots pounding the hard-packed earth, a useless, desperate attempt to head them off. He was too slow. He was one man against their horses and their malice. He could only watch in helpless fury as the sounds of his livelihood, the panicked cries of the animals, faded toward the ravine's edge, followed by the sickening thud and crash of bodies falling into the darkness. A gunshot cracked through the night, shockingly loud and dangerously close. It was not the heavy boom of his Winchester. It was a sharper, lighter report. One of the riders cried out, his horse rearing in panic. A second shot followed, and the other man's hat flew from his head. They spun their horses around, firing blindly into the darkness toward the cabin, and then they were gone, galloping away as if the devil himself were on their heels. Elias stood, stunned, the rifle hanging heavy in his hands. The shots had come from the cabin, from the porch. He turned slowly, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. May stood there, a silhouette against the faint light from the open cabin door. In her hands she held a pistol. It was a Navy Colt, smaller than his own, but it looked as if it were an extension of her arm. She held it with a two-handed grip, her stance perfectly balanced, her focus absolute. It was the stance of someone who knew the weapon intimately. He walked back to the cabin, his legs feeling unsteady. The immediate threat was gone, but a new, more profound shock had taken its place. He stopped in front of her. The air smelled of spent gunpowder and cool night air. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" he asked, his voice rough with disbelief. She lowered the pistol, her movements fluid and economical. She did not look at him, her eyes still scanning the darkness where the riders had vanished. "My father believed a woman's mind and her hands should be equally well armed," she said, her voice calm, devoid of any tremor. "He hired the best tutor in San Francisco." He stared at her, at the small, delicate woman who had just driven off two armed men with a display of marksmanship that would have been the envy of any gunslinger he had ever known. He had seen her as a porcelain doll, a burden, then as a resilient survivor. Now he saw something else entirely, a warrior. The last of his misconceptions about her crumbled into dust. They had destroyed part of his herd, had struck a devastating blow, but they had also made a fatal error. They had revealed his greatest, most unexpected asset. They were no longer one man and a helpless woman against Thorne's gang. They were a garrison of two. The partnership, forged in the quiet truce of the storm, was now solidified by the fire and smoke of a shared battle. They had to rely on each other completely, and in that shared moment of crisis, the transactional arrangement his mother had made felt like a lifetime ago. It was a distant, meaningless memory. All that mattered now was the woman standing before him and the war they had to win together. The attack on the herd was only the beginning. Elias knew Thorne would not stop there. Humiliation had been added to greed, and the combination was volatile. The next assault would be direct, aimed at the cabin, at them. They spent the next day in grim preparation. They boarded up the smaller windows, leaving only narrow slits for firing. They hauled water from the well until every bucket and barrel was full. Elias checked his ammunition, laying out cartridges on the rough-hewn table. Beside his heavy point, 4 caliber rounds, May placed her own, a neat row of .36 caliber cartridges for her Navy Colt. She had a second pistol in her trunk and a box of ammunition that suggested she had come prepared for far more than a quiet life as a rancher's wife. The quiet between them was no longer one of observation, but of shared purpose. Every task was completed with an unspoken understanding. When he lifted a heavy shutter, she was there to brace it. When she cleaned and reloaded her pistols, he passed her the oil and rags without being asked. In the midst of their preparations, he found himself watching the way she moved, the intense focus in her eyes. The question of who she really was, why she was truly here, burned in his mind, but it was not the time for questions. It was the time for survival. Thorn came at dawn. He did not send his men this time. He led them. There were 6 of them, a small army against the cabin's 2 defenders. They fanned out, taking cover behind the rocks and sparse trees that dotted the landscape in front of the house, their rifles glinting in the pale morning light. The siege had begun. "He means to burn us out," Elias said, his voice a low growl as he watched from a slit in the front shutter. "They'll try to get close with torches." "The well is on the west side," May said from her position at a side window. Her voice was steady, analytical. "They will have to cross open ground to get to it, or to the house from that direction. That is their weakness." He glanced at her, a flicker of surprise cutting through his tension. She was not just a good shot. She was a tactician. She saw the layout of the land not as a homesteader, but as a general. The final confrontation had begun, and with it, the great unmasking. As the first shots rang out, splintering the wood of the cabin walls, the truth began to emerge, piece by piece between volleys. "You're no mail-order bride," he stated, firing the Winchester, the recoil a familiar punch against his shoulder. He saw one of Thorn's men duck back behind a boulder. "No," she replied, her own pistol cracking sharply. "I am not." A cry from outside told her she had found her mark. "Then why are you here?" he demanded, levering another round into the chamber. The air in the cabin was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder, a fog of war that seemed to loosen their tongues. She paused her firing, her eyes still scanning the terrain. "I came for him," she said, her voice tight with a cold, controlled fury that startled him. "For Silas Thorn." She looked at him then, and in her eyes he saw a story of loss as profound as his own. "My father was a merchant in the East. He built a shipping company from nothing. Thorn was his business partner, a silent partner. He used his money and influence to help my father secure contracts, and in return, he took a share of the profits." Another volley of shots peppered the cabin walls, and they both returned to the fight, their movements synchronized, a deadly rhythm of fire and reload. He covered the front, she covered the west flank. They were a brutally efficient unit. "Thorn grew greedy," she continued, her words punctuated by the crack of her pistol. "He wanted it all. He used the law, lawyers, and false documents to systematically ruin my father. He created debts where there were none, forged signatures on contracts, and bled the company dry from the inside. When my father discovered the betrayal, it was too late. He was ruined, disgraced. The shame. It killed him." Elias felt a cold knot form in his stomach. This was not just about land and water anymore. This was about a vengeance as deep and personal as his own grief. The whole arrangement, his mother's letter, May's arrival, it had all been a lie, a brilliant, desperate deception. The mail-order advertisement was a ruse, she explained, anticipating his next question. "I knew Thorn had family out here. I needed a way to get close to him. a way to arrive in this valley without raising suspicion, to be seen as a harmless woman, a bride for a reclusive rancher. It was the perfect cover. No one would look twice at me. She paused, and her voice dropped. I did not know your mother was his cousin. That was a coincidence that nearly ended my plan before it began. Suddenly, it all clicked into place. Her resilience, her skills, her quiet observation. She had not been measuring him as a husband. She had been assessing him as a potential obstacle or ally in her war against Thorn. The leather case she guarded so closely. It was not filled with personal trinkets. The evidence, he breathed, a sudden, stunning realization dawning on him. You have proof. I have his ledgers, she said, the real ones. My father kept a duplicate set, hidden away. They show the truth of every transaction, every theft. They are enough to see him imprisoned for the rest of his life. Outside, Thorn was growing impatient. Burn them out, he roared, his voice carrying clearly in a lull in the shooting. Two of his men broke cover, running low toward the house, torches sputtering in their hands. Elias's Winchester boomed, and one man fell. But the other was close, too close. He was about to hurl the torch onto the dry wood of the porch roof when May's pistol fired twice in quick succession. The man dropped the torch and staggered back, clutching his shoulder before collapsing. Thorn let out a stream of curses. He was losing, and he was being defeated by a reclusive rancher and a woman he had dismissed as a piece of property. It was infuriating him, making him reckless. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place for Elias. Thorn hadn't just wanted the water. He must have somehow learned of May's identity, of the threat she represented. He wasn't trying to drive a rancher off his land. He was trying to bury a witness and destroy the evidence that could ruin him. The fight raged on, a desperate battle of attrition. Elias was a bulwark, his powerful rifle keeping Thorn's men pinned down. May was a phantom, moving between windows, her quick, precise shots chipping away at their numbers and their nerve. But they were still outnumbered. A bullet tore through the shutter near Elias's head, showering his face with splinters. He felt a sharp, burning pain in his arm and looked down to see blood soaking through his sleeve. He had been grazed. I'm hit, he grunted, more out of frustration than pain. Before he could react, May was beside him, tearing a strip of cloth from her tunic. It is not deep, she said, her voice calm and authoritative as her deft fingers quickly and tightly bound the wound. Her touch was firm, professional, and in that brief, dangerous moment, a current of something powerful and unspoken passed between them. It was the absolute trust of two soldiers in a foxhole. Just as the last of the daylight began to fade, casting the world in shades of orange and deep purple, they heard it. The sound of more riders approaching fast. For a heart-stopping moment, Elias thought Thorn had sent for reinforcements. But then a voice boomed across the clearing, a voice of weary authority. Thorn, this is Sheriff Brody. Lay down your arms. The sheriff, a man as old and weathered as the hills, had arrived with a single deputy. It was not a force large enough to win a battle, but it was enough to change the nature of the fight. It was no longer a land dispute. It was now an assault witnessed by the law. Silas Thorn, seeing his advantage crumble, his men wounded or dead, and the law at his back, made one last desperate move. He broke cover, not to flee, but to charge the cabin himself, his face a mask of insane rage, his pistol aimed at the door. Elias raised his Winchester, but his wounded arm slowed him. In that split second, May stepped into the doorway, her own pistol already level. There was a single, sharp crack. Thorne stopped, his eyes wide with shocked disbelief. He looked down at the dark stain spreading across his chest. Then his legs gave way, and he fell face first into the dust he had so desperately coveted. He was defeated, not just by force of arms, but by the two people he had underestimated most. Silence descended, absolute and profound. The battle was over. The immediate aftermath was a blur of motion and quiet intensity. Sheriff Brody and his deputy took the remaining surrendered men into custody, their faces a mixture of fear and sullen defeat. The sheriff, after a long look at the scene, at Thorne's body, and at the two figures in the cabin doorway, simply nodded at Elias. He recognized the brutal calculus of frontier justice. He would take their statements in the morning. For now, he would deal with the living and the dead. Inside the cabin, the air was thick and heavy. Lamplight cast a warm, flickering glow on the scene of devastation. The splintered wood, the overturned furniture, the faint haze of smoke that still hung in the air. Elias sank into a chair, the adrenaline draining out of him, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary exhaustion and the throbbing pain in his arm. May moved without a word. She fetched the water bucket and clean cloths. She knelt before him and gently, carefully, began to tend to his wound. Her touch was light but sure, her fingers cleaning the gash with a practiced efficiency that spoke again of a life far more complex than he could have imagined. He watched her face in the lamplight, the fierce concentration in her dark eyes, the set of her jaw. The warrior was gone, replaced by a healer. The silence in the room was no longer tense or observational. It was a space of shared relief, of profound, unspoken acknowledgement. He had fought to protect his home. She had fought for her justice, and somewhere in the blood and gunpowder, their separate battles had become one. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw the woman who had stood beside him, who had faced down death without flinching, who had saved his life more than once that day. He saw the woman who had brought warmth and flavor back into his empty house, who had patched his roof and mended his clothes. He saw the woman who carried the weight of a murdered father and a stolen legacy. "May," he said, his voice raspy. She looked up from his arm, her eyes meeting his. "Thank you," he managed to say. The words felt small, inadequate for what they had just endured together, for what she had done. A small, almost imperceptible softening occurred around her eyes. "We protected our home," she said quietly. It was the first time she had used the word our. It settled in the quiet space between them, a simple, profound statement that redefined everything. In the silent, flickering lamplight of the battered cabin, surrounded by the debris of their shared battle, they were no longer a rancher and a stranger. They were partners. 3 months passed. The seasons turned, and the raw, violent edge of summer softened into the golden melancholy of autumn. The scars on the land began to heal. New grass grew over the scorched earth where Thorne's men had tried to set a fire. The splintered wood of the cabin had been replaced, the shutters repaired, the door hung straight and true on its hinges. The ranch was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was not the hollow silence of solitude, but the peaceful, breathing silence of a shared life. Thorne's empire, built on a foundation of lies and greed, had crumbled. With the evidence from May's ledgers and the sheriff's testimony about the attack, a federal marshal had come from the territorial capital. The subsequent investigation had unraveled a web of corruption that reached far beyond one valley. His name was now a curse, a cautionary tale told in hushed tones in the saloons and general stores. His land was being broken up, sold off by the government to pay his debts. The threat was gone, utterly and completely. In its place, something new was growing. Elias and May worked side by side, their days fallen into a comfortable rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the land. He taught her how to mend fences, how to read the clouds for signs of rain. She, in turn, showed him how to keep accounts with a meticulousness that revealed exactly where the ranch was weak and where it could be strong. They bought a few new head of cattle with the bounty money that had been on some of Thorne's men, a small but significant investment in their future. Their conversations were still sparse, made up of practical questions and simple statements, but the space between their words was filled with a deep, abiding understanding. One crisp afternoon, they worked together in the small plot of land beside the cabin. It was May's garden, but it had become a shared project. He dug into the rich earth, turning the soil, while she followed behind, planting bulbs for the spring. It was a symbolic act, a quiet, tender investment in a future they had fought for and were now building with their own hands. He watched her as she pressed a bulb into the dark soil, her movements deliberate and graceful. The calluses on his hands were no longer a mystery to her, and the strength in her slender frame was no longer a surprise to him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled paper packet. He had traded for it last week in town, sending a special request with a freight driver heading east. He held it out to her. She looked at him, a question in her eyes, and took it. She carefully unfolded the paper. Inside were a dozen small, dark seeds. "Peonies," he said, his voice rough. "The freighter said they grow them where your family was from." May stared at the seeds, her fingers tracing the edge of the packet. She looked up at him, and for the first time he saw a vulnerability in her eyes that mirrored the healed-over wounds in his own soul. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, a silent testament to a grief she had carried for so long. She did not wipe it away. She simply reached out and placed her hand over his where it rested on the handle of the spade. Her touch was warm against his calloused skin. It was not a gesture of passion, but one of profound, grounding partnership. It was an answer, a promise, and an acceptance, all without a single word. He looked down at their joined hands on the tool, the earth waiting for the seeds, and felt a sense of rightness, of peace, that he had thought was lost to him forever. This was home. His mother arrived a week later, unannounced, in a hired buckboard. She descended with the air of a visiting general, her eyes sweeping over the repaired cabin, the mended fences, and finally settling on May, who was hanging laundry on a line strung between two posts. Her expression was a mixture of disapproval and strained civility. She had heard the stories, of course. The whole territory had. She knew of the shootout, of Silas Thorne's death, but the truth of May's role in it was a wild, unbelievable rumor she refused to accept. To her, this was still the strange, foreign girl she had foisted upon her son. "Elias," she said, her voice sharp, pulling him aside as he came to greet her. "It is good to see you well. Now that all this unpleasantness with Silas is over, you can finally set things right." She carried a ceramic plate piled high with a pie, an offering of peace and a tool of maternal leverage. He stood, impassive, waiting. "What things, Mother?" She gestured dismissively toward May with her chin. "You can send the Chinese girl back now. Thank her for her help, of course. But it is time you found a proper wife, a decent woman from town. This arrangement has served its purpose, but it was never meant to be permanent." She saw it as a simple transaction, now concluded. She could not comprehend the bonds that had been forged in gunpowder and shared purpose. Elias did not look at his mother. His gaze was fixed on May, who had paused in her work, her back to them. Yet he knew she could hear every word. He saw the slight tensing of her shoulders. The world seemed to hold its breath. This was the final battle. A quiet one fought not with guns but with a few simple words. He stepped away from his mother, moving to stand beside May. He reached out and took a piece of laundry from her, his hands brushing against hers, a small, public declaration. He looked at his mother, his expression calm but unyielding, a look she had not seen since he was a boy, a look that told her she had reached a boundary she could not cross. "Don't send the Chinese girl back," the rancher whispered, his voice low but carrying with absolute clarity in the still afternoon air. He paused, his eyes never leaving May's. "She is home." His mother's face went slack with shock, her carefully constructed plans, her entire worldview, shattering in that single, quiet statement. The pie plate slipped from her nerveless fingers. It hit the hard-packed earth with a sharp crack, the sound as final and definitive as a gunshot. The perfect pastry broke apart, a sweet, sticky ruin in the dust. She stared at the mess, then at her son and the woman standing beside him, a united front against the world, and for the first time she understood that she had lost. A home, they were both learning, was not just a plot of land or a cabin with four walls. It was not an arrangement or convenience. It was a fragile, fierce thing you built with someone else, something you fought for, bled for, and then, in the quiet aftermath, tended to with care. It was the shared silence on a porch at sunset, the steady presence of another person who knew your scars and stood by you anyway. It was a garden waiting for spring. For Elias and May, two solitary souls brought together by deception and bound by crisis, their home was finally, irrevocably, each other. If you stayed with me all the way through this story of hardship, courage, and unexpected love, thank you. Your time and attention are the greatest compliments a storyteller can receive, and I am truly grateful to have shared this journey with you. If their story moved you, if you felt the dust of the trail and the tension of the siege, please take a moment to hit that like button. It truly helps this channel grow and allows me to bring more stories like this to you. And if you have not already, please consider subscribing so you do not miss the next one. There are many more tales to tell from the quiet corners of the past, stories of resilience, honor, and the enduring power of the human heart. Until then, take care of yourself, and thank you for listening.